Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much for joining me. I am Bree Pappin, the museum coordinator here at the Pueblo City County Library, the Rawlings branch in Pueblo, Colorado. And I'm looking forward to today's presentation. I'll be joined by Dr. Jeff Alexander, and he is Dean of the College of Arts and Sciences at Pueblo Community College here in Pueblo, Colorado, and the author of several books on Japanese culture, including the one we are highlighting today in this presentation, Brewed in Japan, The Evolution of the Japanese Beer Industry. Jeff has traveled extensively to Japan and is revered as one of the foremost experts on modern beer brewing in Japan. And I'm excited to be joined by Jeff today as he shares his presentation with you. Welcome, Dr. Alexander.
Hello, Bree. Thanks so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you. And I am also be sure to have a copy of your book, which we have several copies in our catalog here at the library, and information on how to acquire this book, either by purchase or by checking out from the library catalog, will be available during this program in the comments. And if you have any questions as well for Dr. Alexander, you're welcome to post those in the comments. So, Jeff, what will we be watching today?
Well, Bree, we're going to show a variety of slides and images about Japan's brewing industry over the last 100 plus years, as it began really in the mid-19th century. So, without further ado, please go ahead and show the title slide, and we'll get started.
Okay, great. Thank you so much.
My pleasure to be with you today to present some information about Japan's brewing industry, which goes back to the mid-19th century and has a pretty unique heritage all its own. I've been in and out of Japan many times since 1995, having lived there on and off for several years, and having traveled extensively throughout the country, living and working there, and also brought students there, college students when I was a professor at the University of Wisconsin. At Parkside in Wisconsin. The students came with me in 2011 and 2013, and it was quite a fun opportunity to show them what it had taken me probably almost 20 years to learn all about. What I'm going to do today is showcase a whole host of images, and these are really a collection of material that will show us the origins of the Kirin and Sapporo Beer breweries, as well as the roles played by Mitsubishi and Mitsui, two of Japan's largest companies. I'll look at beer advertising and sales in the 1910s, 20s, and 30s, the industry's transformation during the Second World War, the long-term effects of the wartime command economy, the development of the craft brewing sector since the mid-1990s, and finally, the advent of some very unusual products that we don't have here in the United States or even in the West anywhere. Low malt Haposhu, sort of third category beer products. And finally, we'll talk about Japan's modern beer market, which is very much unlike those in other parts of the world. If anyone's been to Japan, of course, they're familiar with Yokohama. Yokohama is just to the south of Tokyo on Tokyo Bay, and it is very much Japan's front door, and was a front door for a long time, certainly from the mid-19th century when Japan began to reopen and gradually integrate with the West when it came to trade and relations and so forth. Today, Yokohama is a big bustling urban metropolis, and it has all of the things we might expect a modern port city to offer. But long ago, when Japan was just opening up to the West in the 1850s and 60s, Yokohama looked very different. And it was a small sort of bedroom community in many ways. Of course, it had a bustling mercantile sort of exchange, but at the same time, it was beginning to build wharfs and jetties and so forth for Western ships that were coming in for the first time and bringing all kinds of goods and articles with them, mostly for trade, but some for consumption by the foreigners who were permitted by Japan's shogunal government to reside there in Yokohama, in one of the very few places where foreigners were permitted to settle and to live, and to build shops and homes. And so Western traders coming in here were very much the fascination for Japanese artists and woodblock print artists. These prints here showcase the kinds of ships that the Westerners brought and all the goods and things that they unloaded from those ships and came aboard, when they arrived and delivered by train. And finally, many of these prints would showcase the ways that Europeans and Americans looked and the way they carried themselves, their flags, and the way they lived and their homes and things that they had on their tables and in their larders and in their kitchens. And that was very much the fascination for artists and people throughout Japan, many of whom did not yet see a foreigner in person. And so what they were drinking in their cups and so forth was all very fascinating for Japanese at the time. The first brewery to be established in this tradition here, in the sort of European style, came when Kirin's corporate predecessor, the Japan Brewery, was founded in the late 19th century in Yokohama, in a part of the city called Yamate. And that's where a modern brewery was established, and brewing began with fermentation here and some of the primary tons, and finally the finishing room where the product was gradually refined and then finally bottled and so forth. And all the caps here and corks at the time, in fact, being fitted very often by hand because the operation was a burgeoning success, but still relatively small. And all these bottles and their labels and so forth came from Europe, shipped in at great cost. Here's the advertisement at the time from 1890, an ad for Kirin beer, which many of us are familiar with today. Kirin beer was very much the picture of the European style lager, the German style lager, and it was one, and that was the sort of reputation that the company had, was for producing a high quality lager, and that it could equal or rival a European import, because beer was also imported from Europe. Here we see the label that we're familiar with today. It's sort of the qilin, the mythical giraffe-like Chinese unicorn that graces the label even still. And that was the company's calling card for quite some time. That label was in fact purchased from another firm called Media, which was a company that began as a purveyor of items for ships and so on. And finally, it became a popular store selling Western goods. The Mitsubishi is something of a descendant of that label and that iconic, very recognizable logo. Mitsubishi, of course, means three diamonds. And so the Media was the purveyor of items to be used aboard Mitsubishi's company ships. Kirin beer at the beginning was unknown, and beer broadly was unknown to Japanese. People there drank sake if they could afford it, but that was made from refined and fermented rice, so that was not very affordable for everyone. People drank different kinds of alcoholic beverages, but beer was somewhat new, so the companies went to great lengths to try to promote it and make it clear that this was something they might enjoy. And so here we see a beer hall resembling one of Japan's most famous pavilions, Kinkakuji, the Golden Pavilion, which is located in Kyoto. Was reconstructed at Nagoya at the fair, which was again sort of a European and American tradition at the time, was to have fairs and to showcase wares and products. And finally, as it came to marketing and advertising, Kirin's beer was promoted using this and other kinds of vehicles that would travel around the country. This one, a bottle-shaped truck that came from Scotland. And the company wanted to showcase this new product for people in the countryside where perhaps they were less familiar with it. Here's another example of a truck that went moving along. As you can see, it has the license plate number 1, as it was the very first vehicle to actually bear a registration plate that was obtained from the Metropolitan Police Department and agency in the early 20th century. Sadly, the truck was lost in a fire, but the company still owns the rights to the plate number 1, and they still pay for that each year. And here we have the company's Kanzaki plant. This is opening during the First World War, when, of course, Europeans and the United States soon after would be very much embroiled in a conflict on the continent in Europe. And this prevented and really made impossible the kind of export trade to Asia. So European and American beers were not available in great quantity. However, here we see the Kanzaki plant brewing a great deal of beer, and all of that stacked up front is bottles. We see beer bottles stacked far and wide because the production began to ramp up dramatically. But of course, making beer is difficult, and making one's own malts is also extremely difficult. Malts is the sort of thick sugary liquid that is made from the cereal grains that the brewers begin with. And making malts was something that many Japanese brewers even then were still wrestling with. And so during the war, Kirin brought in an American fellow seen in the beginning of this, in the center right here, in the middle of this shot. His name is August Grishel, and his father was a malts master and a malts maker in Wisconsin. And his father was a German immigrant to Wisconsin. And this fellow here was ultimately contracted by Kirin and brought over, and he taught the Japanese companies how to make malts on their own, which was a very difficult process that they had not yet mastered. But with his help, they were able to do so. Now, up north in Sapporo City, which bears the name of another beer brand, Sapporo Beer, this was a kind of place where it was cold in the winter and very snowy, and the sort of place where one could find yet another opportunity to brew. This was a government operation known as the Sapporo Beer Brewery. The grand opening was in 1876, and the company was founded in the north because of the free availability of ice and snow. And in an age before electric refrigeration, having ice and snow was critical to shipping beer successfully. The emperor, Meiji, at the time, paid a royal visit to the Sapporo Beer Brewery in 1877 because this was the kind of burgeoning industrial program and effort that was very successful and that the royal family wished to highlight. And out front we see a small plantation to grow hops, which are of course the the flowery kind of plant material that would be used to stabilize and flavor beers and also to act as a natural preservative. Here's the experimental hops plantation in Hokkaido in 1880. The tall sort of spindly trees are being looked after by these folks here. You can see along the fence line, still wearing traditional clothing even at that time in the 1880s. And here we see women and girls harvesting and sorting hops and the little blossoms that grow on these sort of vine-like, very spindly tree kind of plants. And this too in the 1880s was still a growing concern. But Sapporo Beer, quite like Kirin, began to advertise its German lager, and they introduced here in this ad their engineer, Mr. Max Porman, who was a German who came to live in Japan, as many Europeans came to live in Japan in the late 19th century to teach Japanese companies how to make all of the kinds of Western wares that the importers were bringing. Here we see the engineer, and the ad very much touts the style of the lager and the quality of the product. Here we see boys blowing glass bottles by hand. This too was experimental. All the bottles were chiefly brought in from Europe, but they did try to make bottles of their own. This was a very difficult process that they would not yet master probably until the 1920s. Here by 1900, we see the Sapporo hops plantation, and the factory has become a large brick construction. This too was done in imitation of the European style, and British architects chiefly would come in and help Japanese companies to build these massive brick edifice constructions. These were the kinds of buildings that would dominate the skyline in many of these cities for several decades. Here we see the head office that they constructed by 1900 because brewing was becoming more successful, and gradually more Japanese could afford to buy beer, even if occasionally. Here we see another plant being erected in 1905. Again, another large construction, a big brick edifice with tall smokestacks. These were very much the picture of industry at the time. And it was not just there. Brewing was happening all over the country by brewers large and small, mostly small. And we see a variety of labels here by all sorts of different companies, most of which do not survive. So we have Japan Beer at the top left, Nihon Beer, Nippon being the original pronunciation, the native pronunciation of Japan. And we see other companies besides, Honda Beer, and this next one in the middle here, we see Mitsubishi having tried their hand at it. Next to that, we see Osaka Beer, which was also quite famous. And a lot of these brewers, as I say, would not survive, but several actually would grow and merge together. Here we see Osaka Breweries. This was the brewer of Asahi Beer. It's a label we still know today. And this is around 1900 as well. Still another major construction with the assistance of European architects and designers. Nippon Beer was another of the largest companies alongside Kirin and Sapporo. This would be the other major competitor. And this beer poster advertises Nippon Beer, Japan Beer, by the Japan Beer Breweries Limited. And this was around 1900. We see that Nippon Beer, read in the center of the poster here from right to left, Nippon Bakushu. Bakushu literally being barley wine. is the word that is original to the definition of beer. Magoshi Kyohei was the president of that company, and he was known as the Beer King of the Orient, Toyo no Biro. And he was very much the captain of industry at that time, and they erected a train station here at Ebisu, where the very famous Ebisu beer brand gets its name. And this was a product in affiliation with the Mitsui company, which, like Mitsubishi, wanted to get into supporting the beer brewing industry. So these three companies here managed to merge in 1906 and created a much larger company called Great Japan Beer, Dai Nippon Beer. And this formed in 1906, and this combination of three locations gave them a great deal of opportunity to dominate the marketplace. Just as now, beer is a heavy liquid product and it's difficult to ship, especially in a time when they didn't have ample roadways that were paved or not very many train lines, and moving things by ship does take time. So having factories and breweries in many locations was an advantage, just as it is today. So Sapporo Beer and Osaka and the Nippon Beer Brewery, these three companies merged to form Dai Nippon Beer, and these are their labels. And the label for Ebisu Beer, seen at the top middle here, still features the very same figure today. Here we see other labels, the star being for the North Star. That was the label design chosen for Sapporo Beer Brewing Company at its outset. And these labels carry on in some fashion even today. By the 1920s, the city of Tokyo was a growing metropolitan area with a whole host of important buildings, and this here, as Tokyo Station demonstrates, was very much the picture of the modern era. And at that time, the Crown Prince, Hirohito, came to visit the Dai Nippon Beer Brewery in 1922. Again, the royal family paying attention to industry and supporting it and hoping to develop it even further. We see the company president rushing along ahead of His Royal Majesty to show him all of the wares, and again, the bottles stacked up out front and all the product being made inside the plant. And the future was bright for Japan in the 1920s. Here we see a wide thoroughfare paved for the cars and automobiles and buses that are making their way here and there. However, 1923 was also a very unfortunate year for Japan and for the Tokyo region, when the great Kanto earthquake, named for the region of Kanto surrounding Tokyo, struck on the 1st of September, and the calamity that ensued was horrendous. Over 100,000 people perished in the earthquake and the fires that followed. Here we see the Metropolitan Police Office burning. This was photographed for the Mainichi newspaper. Here we see the Kyobashi area, the lower town where many working families lived. It was completely gutted by fire, and this fire, of course, engulfed much of the city, killed many, many tens of thousands of people. And the Crown Prince went to view the devastation of the city of Yokohama next door, which was likewise burned very badly, from the top of a bank club. This meant that the royal family was now interested in the city's reconstruction, and that led to the reconstruction also of the breweries. This is the Kirin finishing plant in Yokohama. Following the great Kanto earthquake, it was destroyed, and so too were the finishing plant and also some of the warehouses that stored the beer. In fact, in this case, wooden casks were still being used, wooden barrels. And because of the intensity of the earthquake, many of the barrels, hundreds of them, smashed open, and the volume of beer that spilled out of the warehouse almost drowned some of the people living in the surrounding neighborhood. It was a terrible disaster. But of course, time brought reconstruction, and the Japanese are very good, as we know, at rebuilding after disasters. So here we see a large ferro-concrete structure, and this poster here advertises the brand new, newly reconstructed Kirin factory at Namamugi in Yokohama, which began, of course, a new era for brewing and industrial-sized brewing. Here we see women on the Kirin bottle sterilization line. All the bottles were sterilized before adding the product. And we see the beer delivery truck. This is at the Ford dealership. The sign above the door there on the left says Fordo. This is the Ford dealership around 1929, and this is the Sapporo Beer delivery truck that was in operation at that time. And in Sapporo, where the city did not experience the terrible earthquake, that original building still survives. And it too was also spared much of the damage of the Second World War, as we'll see. But this began to expand even further, and once more, Emperor Hirohito, the emperor at this time, takes the throne from 1926, and he pays a royal visit to the Dai Nippon Beer Brewery in 1932. He arrives in the royal coach, and everybody is standing by to greet him. And why don't we go inside and see what he sees? This is the modern trommel separators that rotate the mash in order to sift it. And we have copper beer kettles now installed where hops are added to the brew and the brewing actually takes place. And we now have automated bottle systems and bottle manufacturing equipment, which is a major innovation. Much of this equipment was purchased from the United States for relatively little cost because the United States by that time had entered prohibition. And many of the brewing factories and breweries and so forth across the country were shuttered and closed. And a lot of that equipment was sold off and shipped to the West Coast and ultimately by ship to Japan. Here we see the mechanized beer bottling line in the 1930s. This equipment could be bottling milk or other liquids. In this case, it's bottling beer. And an enormous pasteurizing and labeling line by the 1930s. We see these enormous cookers in the back, numbered 1 and 2 and 3. These are enormous pasteurization machines that will cook the beer and ensure that the fermentation process will stop. And then down below, the crating and the storage warehouse, where men are working as quickly as they can to get the beer stacked in crates ready for shipping. And of course, after seeing all this, His Royal Majesty was very tired, and so he sat down on this, the royal chair that was provided for him during his visit, which was subsequently photographed and appears today in a company history because the firm was so proud of the emperor's visit at the time. For his work and his trouble, Ohashi Shintaro, the chairman of the board, received the Order of the Rising Sun with Gold and Silver Star in 1937, one of Japan's very highest honors. And he, like other captains of industry, was celebrated and supported because Japan was seeking independence from European imports and American imports and wanted to prepare itself to be independent in terms of both military and industrial capability. So let's move on and talk about advertising. This is a painted lithograph poster for Sapporo Beer from 1918, featuring a very traditional young Maiko, who is perhaps seen here in Kyoto with a fan that bears the star for Sapporo Beer. These kinds of posters were lithographs, and they were very popular. They're based somewhat on European posters, and Europeans, of course, had imitated Japanese style from the woodblock print era of the late 19th century. So this style of advertising went back and forth from Europe to Japan several times. Here we see another poster for Sapporo Beer from 1920. And this one here features 3 Maiko. It's quite a famous painting, and it's very beautiful. Now we have a different style of advertising. This one showcases Western themes. So here we see a gentleman at the cabaret, and he's seeing some dancers, and they are dressed in Western clothes, and he too has a suit of Western clothes, and he has bottles of Sapporo Beer on the table. And this sort of speaks to the imagery of the time and the style associated with dressing in Western clothes and engaging in Western entertainments and so forth. Here we have another that showcases Western technology, of course, this airplane here. The age of flight has arrived, and now we see modern imagery of skylines and busy factories and, of course, airplanes and so forth. And, of course, Keibajo, which was and remains horse racing and has always been the sport of kings, both in Europe and in Japan and the United States. It's been very popular for a long time. And here we have Sapporo Beer being advertised, and this jockey here is enjoying himself a large glass. And so then there's another trope, another theme that we can find for advertising. This one here by the 1930s showcases the flapper girl, the independent young woman who might be seen at the dance hall or the cabaret or the cinema perhaps. And this one doesn't even showcase beer at all. It simply says Sapporo Beer on the label. This lady here wearing Western clothes, perhaps a uniform for her job or her college, is holding aloft a glass of Kirin beer, and she too is sort of the picture of modernity with her pin curl hairstyle, and she would have been very much emulated by young women at the time. Here we see young ladies drinking at a Yoshuba, which is a Western liquor bar in Tokyo in 1934. And they would mostly be drinking cocktails at that time. However, beer was on offer, but chiefly women drank cocktails and men drank beer. Beer was a darker, heavier, bitter beverage, and it did not appeal very often to women or to young people. And so beer was typically sold in beer halls like this one. This is a beer hall that sells Sapporo. It sells the Ebisu brand. The Y is silent. It's an Ebisu. And it is an image from 1929, and the bar and the image is sort of festooned with flags because they sort of went hand in hand with the kinds of images that we would see as Japan rose to prominence in East Asia and gradually came to carve out an empire in that part of the world. Here's the Sapporo Beer Hall, the beer hall at Gosaibashi in Asakusa, which is a part of Tokyo. Not a very elaborate looking building, but again, another sort of place where men typically would congregate in order to drink beer. Beer was sold for consumption at home. This is the East Liquor Shop selling the Ebisu brand in 1929. And we see that the crates are stacked up out front. There's a large bottle on display on top. This is sort of the calling card for the shop. Here's another hall selling Ebisu brand beer in 1933. This would be a place, again, where men would congregate and drink beer together. And even in other parts of the growing empire, this is in Pyongyang in Korea. Today is North Korea. But at the time, it was part of the Japanese Empire. And the Japanese had annexed Korea in 1910. So this is the Kirin Beer Brewery in Pyongyang, which Japan was slowly converting into a more westernized metropolis. And of course, that campaign took them into China. And the ill-fated attempt to conquer China by the 1st of January 1940, which is Shogatsu, which is New Year's Day, features these members of the Imperial Japanese Army toasting, not with sake, although that's available too, but also with beer, which was provided for soldiers at the front, which unfortunately led to calamity more than a few times. Here we see wartime labels for generic beer or bakushu printed in 3 types. As rationing carried on through the war and ink became more scarce, beer labels were printed in 3 colors only, and the individual beer brands disappeared, and the brewing industry largely became a government concern. The government took over control of many industries in the interest of promoting the war effort, streamlining production, and so individual companies weren't necessary any longer. It was deemed necessary only to produce beer, largely for consumption by the populace through rationing tickets, and to raise money, effectively tax money for the war effort. Here is a household beer ration coupon. It's a card that permits each household to have 2 bottles of beer, very large bottles, about 720 ml per month, which was a way to help fortify people's diets, as rationing meant very meager supplies during the war period. And here's the Kirin Beer Hall, seen just above the trolley car, which has been devastated by the atomic bomb dropped on Hiroshima in August of 1945. By the fall, this is an image that shows that Kirin Beer Brewery behind the streetcar here. It was perhaps unexpected that people could even live there for maybe another 100 years, possibly 1,000 years, because of the radiation. But as it turns out, the radiation dissipated relatively quickly, and they were able to revive the beer brewery, and production resumed within 6 months, which was reasonably remarkable. So the wartime era really impacted the beer industry pretty greatly. It preserved the market, it strengthened its leaders, it eliminated competing brewers and retailers. There had been many once upon a time, but lots of those were dissolved. It created a unified sales and distribution network. There was one type of beer largely, and it was distributed as efficiently as possible. Beer bottle shapes were standardized. They used to have many different kinds, and that was inefficient for volume and for taxation. They introduced the idea of mandatory bottle return, which is common in several countries, including parts of Europe and Canada. Not so common here in the United States, but beer bottle returns back to the manufacturer enabled them to wash and sterilize the bottles and use them once more. It also established modern industry associations, and it transformed beer itself into a lighter tasting beverage that wasn't quite as heavy because the availability of hops was scarce, flavoring ingredients and so forth were not available, and so beer became a lighter, sort of almost alcoholized soda. And, of course, Japan was brewing for new masters. In the post-war, between 1945 and 1952, the Allied occupation, nominally, but chiefly a United States effort, resulted in all sorts of Allied forces moving to Japan to help with that occupation effort, and those soldiers needed something to drink. And so the breweries were reopened relatively quickly, despite the rationing of the post-war era for the general populace. And by the end of that period, here we see Japan's Prime Minister, Yoshida Shigeru, throwing a party at his home to celebrate Japan's independence. And although, again, sake is available, he is toasting with beer. And this celebrates Japan's regained sovereignty, including their flag and self-government. Students at Tokyo University, bless their hearts, here they are drinking beer through straws at a campus event in 1952. Making the most of things. We see bottles of soda available too, but this was a new market for the brewers in the post-war. Here we see this young lady at center. Before the war, she would not have been one of their clients very often, but because beer had a lighter, more palatable taste for women and younger people, beer became quite popular. Here we see young women in the late 1950s drinking at a beer garden. Beer gardens are quite popular in Europe, and they became somewhat popular in Japan as well, where space was available. And by the late 50s, more women had a job. Perhaps they had some disposable income. They could travel a little bit on their own. And here we see young women simply drinking together in groups, which was not common prior to the war, but became more common thereafter. And here we see a rooftop beer garden atop the Daiichi Seimei building in Osaka, because as gardens are not very common in busy urban spaces where land is at a premium, the new buildings and skyscrapers offered a place to put some astroturf, as we might know it, some artificial turf, and to open up a beer garden and give it some sort of ambiance in the evenings. And the breweries were reconstructed too. Here we see the one in Hiroshima that was rebuilt by the mid-1950s, a much larger, much more productive facility. Here's an aerial view of the brewery in Hiroshima in the mid-50s. In Yokohama too, the brewery was expanded and reconstructed. And in Tokyo as well, a very modern image of the 1950s, this sort of streamlined modernist kind of approach. Customers, of course, began to drink beer more frequently and more commonly by the late 50s. Beer sales eclipsed those of sake for the first time. And although the sake machine at the right is available, these customers are lining up at the beer vending machine, which became a very popular phenomenon. Here we see gentlemen in the 1970s enjoying a beer that comes from the vending machine. Beer vending machines are still quite popular in Japan. Many things are sold in vending machines there, and it's one of the most profitable industries. Here we see some beer vending machines from a more modern era. They have all sorts of different products available. They can sell coffees and juices and so on. Unlike in the United States, companies there in Japan, they might produce all sorts of different beverages and sell them, whether they have alcohol in them or not. And of course, they do regulate alcohol sales to those 20 and over. But unlike here in the United States, it's not necessary to separate your markets necessarily. A company can produce coffee or juice or an alcoholic beverage and ship those just as easily. So there's no sort of special, unique brewing capability on the part of some firms. Here we see a Sapporo machine, and it's selling a whole host of things too, including this large bottle at the bottom left here, the Sapporo Giant. There it is. That's a large, that's cost over $10 US. You simply put your money in the slot and the beer is dispensed. Here we see a liquor shop that's supposed to provide beverages for those 20 and over, but it sometimes is used by minors, not a whole lot, but they do claim that generally speaking, people are observant of the law. Brewing today in Japan has become a very modern kind of industry. As we might expect, things are automated and a good deal of roboticization has set in. There's a lot of automated machinery. These kettles fill themselves and brew themselves, and they empty themselves, and they are self-cleaning, they wash themselves. And I took these photos in 2008 upon visiting several of the breweries there. Their outdoor storage tanks were developed, no more wooden casks, no more brick buildings. Japan pioneered outdoor storage tanks, any one of which they often tell visitors would take, if you drank a 12-ounce glass every day, how long would it take to drink the tank? It would take 10,000 years because the volume is so great. Some of these tanks even broke open in earthquakes from time to time, but they do repair them pretty quickly. There's almost nobody working at this factory. When you visit, you might see 3 or 4 people. You might see someone driving a forklift. You might see a gardener, such as this fellow here, winding up a hose. You might see someone in the laboratory working with a yeast culture. But there's not a lot of activity, not human activity. Much of it is automated. The trucks do come and go. This one sort of a frightening reminder, perhaps, of all the beers you might have drank last week as it makes its way to market. Super Dry was Japan's innovation to the beer industry in the mid and late 1980s, and the Asahi Super Dry brand is still available today, and it was very popular as it went well with heavier Japanese cuisines. And then finally, it leads us to the craft beer industry. Craft beer, of course, became very popular here in the United States from the late 1970s, perhaps, and gradually gained traction through the 80s, and by the 90s it became more popular, and it's very common today. It's also something of a media darling in Japan, but we don't really see much market share. They call it Jibiru, originally a local beer. Now it's called Japanese craft beer. This brewer here, Kyuchi, is one of the more famous, and it survives today. But the deregulation of the alcohol excise tax law is what enabled companies to get into this market. They lowered the minimum production level from 2,000 kiloliters to just 60. A kiloliter is about 8.5 barrels. So it was easier for people to get into this market for the first time. The earliest businesses started with Ichigo Beer in Niigata, and then another in Asakusa in Tokyo, and then further one in Hokkaido, and others besides. So these gradually popped up in the mid-90s, and during that decade, there were many, many companies that really burst onto the scene. By the year 2000, there were 240, perhaps more. But in the years that followed, there was a sharp decline and a contraction in the market because it's not easy to make money in this industry. The taxation is extremely high. Japan has a national health service, and many of these things are paid for with the kinds of taxes that you might expect on liquor products or tobacco or what have you. So this meant that it was not something that many companies could survive in for very long. The craft brewers found that there's just too much mediocre Japanese craft beer. There were very few outstanding brands, according to the brewers. Home brewing has been illegal for generations, and very few people had the space at home anyway. Consumers had a little knowledge of craft beer or their flavors as a result. So people were not familiar with what perhaps a stout looked like or tasted like, or a pale ale or whatever we might have today. Interested brewers therefore had little access to training or Japanese language text. Certainly in the mid-90s, that has improved somewhat, and the availability of literature on the internet has really helped. But there's been just too little craft beer industry entrepreneurialism. There's just been not enough activity. So beyond that, production taxes reach perhaps $2.89 a liter in the United States. Brewery taxes, production taxes per liter might be 7 or 8 cents. So this is a much, much more heavily taxed industry in Japan than it is here. So as a result, craft beer holds less than 1% of Japan's beer market. And that's largely because the major brewers own much of the real estate in the shops and in the convenience stores and places where beer is sold. So they ensure through wholesalers and that kind of control that brewers generally have to produce it and sell it themselves. So they must capture more links in the value chain. They have to both make the beer and sell the beer, usually in their own bars and shops and the kinds of restaurants that they might own. In addition, Japan has a very unique product called happoshu, or what's known as sparkling spirit. This is a kind of beer-like product that features less than 67% malts, and that was the official definition of beer from the German beer purity law of 1516, known as the Reinheitsgebot. This law required that the beverage produced had to feature at least 2/3 malts by grist weight. And this is a product that does not meet that standard. As a result, it didn't have to be taxed as heavily as beer. And so they started making it with 50% malts, or 25, or less than 25, or perhaps almost none at all. And this became a race to the bottom, and they began making beer out of all kinds of different things, and brewing them and flavoring them with peas instead of hops, or all kinds of different additives, and they have a kind of a consistency of beer. They're kind of a yellowish color. They pour and look like a beer, but they don't always taste like one, or not exactly like one. But on a hot day, if you only have 135 yen in your pocket, you can certainly buy a can of it and give it a try. Some of it is seasonal. It's quite popular. It has taken over much of Japan's marketplace, and some people do enjoy it. So overall, the outcomes for this industry over the course of the century and more that it's been in business are that the advent of craft brewing has had little significant impact on beer culture. The innovation in this beer-like market is unprecedented, it's highly creative, and it has no real international parallels. We don't see much of that here. Japan's leading brewers have had, quite a successful run fending off competition from foreign beer and craft brewers, but they've driven very inexpensive wedge between their consumers and their full malt beers, or their traditional beers. So ironically, full malt beer has become kind of a luxury product, like it was in the late 19th century, when very few people could yet afford it or afford to drink it very often. So today, beers that are made entirely with malts per the traditional recipes are sold as sometimes a luxury beer, a 100% malts kind of a product, and it might be the sort of thing that you would be told that you could pick up for Dad on Father's Day. That's a common kind of marketing approach. So this is the way that the beer industry in Japan has evolved over time, very much showcasing itself as a European product in the beginning, but gradually, certainly after the Second World War, coming to have a sort of quality all of its own. And today, most consumers in Japan really wouldn't think twice about where beer comes from. They may have a vague understanding of its European origins, but at the same time, alcoholic beverages have been brewed and distilled the world over for many, many thousands of years. So the Japanese feel as entitled to brew and enjoy beer as people anywhere else. And so that's the story of Brewed in Japan, and it's still evolving today.
Thank you so much. I've definitely gotten an education today. I am left with some questions, and I'm sure that our viewers will also have some. I'm curious to know, during the 30s in the United States, during Prohibition, and when Japan began to adapt American technologies in terms of brewing, due to that, did Japan ever experience a dry period?
No, that's a great question. As a matter of fact, no. Japan has had a relationship with alcoholic beverages for a long, long time, and there was never the same kind of moralizing that happened in the West, and chiefly in the United States, also Canada, other places that had a period of prohibition. That didn't really take place. They did have a temperance movement, and they did have the kinds of temperance advocates, like the Women's Christian Temperance Union, which was very popular in the United States and Canada and Europe and to some degree. They also had chapters in Japan, but they were never able to really convince people that drinking alcohol was somehow amoral or was a problem for society in quite the way that they did in the West. And so there was an effort to abstain to a certain degree, or perhaps drink less. But alcohol has a long history with Japanese culture, and not only consuming it, but giving offerings, perhaps. The Shinto shrines will very often see bottles of sake or things like that placed there as an offering. So it had woven itself into the fabric of society pretty tightly by that time. And so there never was much of a period of prohibition like we had here.
So then jumping off of that, in America, United States, and beer and popular culture and automobile culture, hot rod culture are such big parts of each other. During that mid-century period in Japan, was that synonymous with that as well?
That's a great question. The marketing of beer in the West and in Japan has had a large number of phases over time since the Second World War period. Early in the post-war, beer was a very thin kind of lager beverage. They didn't revert to the heavier recipes that most countries had enjoyed prior to the war for quite a long time. Some countries, European countries in particular, went back more quickly. British brewers went back more quickly. American lagers stayed quite thin and relatively light for a long time. And the Japanese, too, for a long time, and even still, the major brewers continue to produce that style of beer. However, they did experiment a little bit with different styles and then pairing those styles with different lifestyles. So there were lighter beverages, perhaps for younger people. There were heavier sort of malty beverages. There were not very many hoppy beverages at the time for quite a long time, but they did sort of pair certain brands up with going outdoors or adventurous kind of outdoor activities, going fishing, that kind of thing. And that was common in the United States also. Certain brewers would showcase their wares alongside those kinds of images. But the way that beer is marketed in the United States, alongside motorsports and things like that, you're right. That is, I think, much more prominent here than it was in Japan, or even is in Japan still. They still had that same sort of approach of approaching beer as kind of a recreational way to enjoy yourself after work, but they didn't quite pair it with sports to the same degree that we have here.
Yeah, there's just a huge influence of mid-century culture, pop culture in Japan right now, and for the last, like, say, 10 to 15 years, and vice versa. And I just wonder how much of that translates into modern popular culture in Japan. I also noticed that women are very prominent in the beer culture, well, in the actual industry. And in the 20s, you speak about the women in the factories working, and that is such an opposite mirror of what was happening here in the 20s, where women were fighting for their right to vote and just to be seen as an equal human, basically, to have the rights that all men do. And then you see that same thing, use of women in advertising, but not as objectifying women, but more of like elevating and celebrating. So is that those two comparisons? Is that something that's continued through the years in terms of women marketing in beer advertising?
I would say yes. The use of and the showcasing of women in those lithograph posters from the teens, 20s, 30s, that you're right. The images are quite either traditional or showcasing Western styles and hairstyles and clothing and so forth. And that was, you're right, it wasn't objectifying in quite the way we might expect to see by sort of the late 20th century. There was a phase of the woman in a bikini holding a beer aloft, and those posters were not uncommon in neighborhood taverns, known as izakaya, and those kinds of shops. But that kind of imagery was very commonplace in television media, for example, or beer posters perhaps you might see on trains or on billboards. So it's a little bit more refined, if you will, not quite as risque. But the other approach that was similar was that in the teens, 20s, 30s, women also did not have the right to vote in Japan. But ironically, that was then enshrined in the Constitution in the post-war, very much actively by the United States and General MacArthur wishing to drive a wedge between the populace and the military. And so women were given the right to vote en masse in the new Constitution in 1947. And that ironically took really Japan into a new era where, at least in the Constitution, women had more rights than they enjoyed in the United States. However, inversely, women actually exercise more rights in the United States than they do in Japan even today, and are represented more evenly in industry in the United States than they would be in Japan. There are very few company owners in Japan. Corporate CEO representation would be smaller, and so forth. So the segmentation of markets and the approach of manufacturers are selling their products to these markets is a little different. But it's that lighter flavor after the war that made beer popular with women and young people. And companies were quick to pick up on that, and they actually made a conscious decision to market beer to women as well as men, rather than simply leave it to be a preserve, some sort of male preserve. Because bars before the war were seen as seedy places and not the kind of place that a young lady should perhaps visit, not like a cabaret or a cinema or something like that. But by the post-war, it became somewhat normalized for women to consume beer, perhaps in groups. Even in newspaper editorials, people would ask, well, even in the more conservative newspapers, people would wonder, are we okay with this? Is this all right? And then they would conclude, yes, I guess we're okay with this. It doesn't seem very harmful.
There's definitely more of a conscience behind it than would be here, where it's just kind of a all-out advertising, money mongering thing in the United States in terms of marketing for that particular genre or audience. Whereas I see in Japan, there's much more of a conscious in terms of, let's stay on this path.
Yes, and in fact, some of that came from Okinawa as well in the South, which we didn't have time to get to today, but a brewer there in the post-war initially founded a brewery, and while they did sell to many of the U.S. occupation forces there, they also sold to Japanese people, and the owner was quite innovative. He hosted parties for women where they did not have to bring anyone as their escort. They could simply come on their own. So office ladies, or OL as they're known, office ladies would come and they would bring either a friend or a male companion if they wished, but they didn't have to bring anyone if they chose. And that was a real departure for Okinawan culture, where previously women were very often at home and they were not spoken about even in public. And so for that company to open that door to young women to come in and simply have a place to enjoy themselves was a real departure. And companies in the mainland of Japan started to notice that and imitate it too.
Thank you so much today. I have learned an enormous amount. And I just want to reiterate, your book is called Brewed in Japan. I'm going to put it over here. Brewed in Japan. It's available here at the Pueblo Library District for checkout. And also we will make your available for purchase as well through your company or through the publishing company. Is that correct?
Yes, it's available not only on Amazon and places like that, but it's available directly from the publisher. And from time to time, they have a discount. So check it out.
Okay. Thank you so much again for joining us. And we invite you to enjoy all of the programs, films, and presentations that we have planned for Natural Framing, which is our current exhibit of the Frank D. Morimoto life and work. Thank you so much again, Dr. Alexander, for joining us today.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Thank you. Bye-bye.